So we continue working on decision making, and now we'll see gameplay between Gurevich against Diu. And actually there's one middle game position I want to focus on, and we'll quickly see the opening of this game to see how we got there. I think it's important to analyze the opening, the context of how we get to that middle game. So same as last chapter, we've got in English, white plays knight c3, knight f6. White plays a similar line to the game we saw in the last video, a3, g6, white plays fianchetto as well. Black is not trying to play e4 because that pawn might be, it's going to be weak actually, I should say. If black plays an early e4, white is ready to capture that pawn playing knight to g5. So before playing something like e4, black needs better development. So bishop g2, castles, now white plays d3. So suddenly we get one of the main positions of the English against the King's Indian. White castles too, and here black plays knight to d4. So for those who play the King's Indian as black, I would recommend here h6, and there's a reason for that. We stop white's main idea in this line. To explain that, I'll show you another line. Let us say I play something like a5, then white can play bishop g5. That's his main idea, h6. Despite losing the bishop pair, white has a great position here because that bishop wasn't doing much, and now by taking our knight on f6, white is ready to play knight d5. The other knight might jump to e4. We can see this bishop is doing a great job on that diagonal, and also white is ready to play rook b1 plus b4. So white has a straightforward plan here, whereas black is not able to attack on the king side yet, and that's what he's looking for when black plays the King's Indian. Also, if we play something like knight d4, white can simply play e3. We have to move the knight back. So this line is interesting. It's one of the main lines actually, but I like playing h6 because then white will have to find another square for that bishop on c1, and it's also good to stop our opponent's main ideas. That's the reason why I like h6 in this position. There are other moves like rook e8, but we're not going to talk about theory. We're going to talk about what happened in this middle game. Black plays knight to d4, and here white has the first decision. Should we take on d4 or should we play something else? And usually when we see trades or changes in the pawn structure, we need to be careful. So of course we need to consider knight takes d4 because that pawn structure changes. But I think here this is changing to black's benefit. Not only black is attacking the knight, black also opens up the e-file, and that pawn e2 is backwards. With that said, this is still playable for white. I don't think white's worse, but black, by trading some pieces off, by opening up the file, black is freeing up its position. And also by removing that knight from c6, black wants to play c6 himself, and then our bishop on g2 is limited. So I wouldn't take on d4 yet. I don't want to give black a target on the e-file, especially not after the e-file being opened up. So taking on d4 doesn't feel right for white at the moment. There's no need to calculate much. It's about paying attention to the positional nuances. So instead, what white did is smarter. Knight to d2. We avoid trades. We can play e3 afterwards, and then if necessary we can come back to f3. Alright, so coming back to the game, after knight d2, black plays c6, white plays e3, and now black has two squares to go to, f5 or e6. There's nowhere else. Let me clear those arrows. Knight f5, knight e6, we've got no intermezzo moves, because if we play bishop g4, then white simply plays f3. Those pawns are really annoying. We're going to lose a piece here. So, where to move the knight to? f5 or e6? I think this is the first question we need to answer in this chapter. Pause the video, take your time, as I always say, pretend this is a real game, and find the best line for black. So, in this position, I think black has to go back to e6. There's a simple reason for that. In the game, black played knight f5, and the thing is, after knight f5, our knight is not going anywhere. I don't think we want to play knight h6, and coming back to e7 is passive, to say the least. So, unless we have some ideas on the king side, maybe something like this, which seems a bit unrealistic at this point. We've got no development to attack. White can always bring more pieces to the king side. I don't think knight f5 is that good. If we play knight e6 instead, the knight is controlling both sides of the board. We still control the center as well. We can get more pieces out, and at some point we can try playing d5. So, again, it's based on intuition. We don't really need to calculate much. We know from e6 our knight has more potential, and we've got more squares to go to. We'll see that in the game after knight f5, black had some issues with that knight. We'll see knight f3, here black played rook to e8, and white now plays e4. And again, we've got two squares to go to, d4 or e7. I don't think h6 counts as a square, by the way, because that's way too passive. And I think black here made the same mistake in terms of where to move the knight to. Knight e7, that's what happened in the game. Way too passive, the knight's not going anywhere, we've got no potential here. And I understand why black didn't play knight e4. In order to understand that, we can flip the board. Knight d4 is not as powerful as it was before, because now we can take, pawn takes, and then we play knight e2. Unlike the other position where black played knight d4, now white does not have the pawn on e2. The pawn is on e4, so there's no attack for black on the e file. White does not have a backwards pawn. We attack the pawn's d4, so black plays c5, we can play h3, and yes, it is fair to say white is ahead. White has an extra pawn on the king side, black has double pawns, and this bishop's diagonal is closed. So yes, white is ahead. But okay, black can try something on the queen side as well. The game is far from over. What happened in the game after knight e7 is that black just got a passive position, and white takes the lead with d4. We see that knight on e7 has no squares to go to. For those who play the King's Indian, you probably know the fianchetto system, and black usually plays with knight d7 and c6, This would be a well-known position, and then black can take on d4, and knight d7 has a lot of squares to go to. This is different though, because that knight on e7, as we know, is lacking squares. So after d4, I really like how black played here. Its position is worse, but at least black is trying to complicate things. If black takes on d4, then white simply takes back. White has more space, better pieces, and for black we've got no counterplay here. I don't think d5 is likely to work. We can always run into moves like e5. And white also has this Maroczy bind where it's controlling the center. That pawn on d6 is a weakness, and white is just 2-3 moves away from getting the bishop, the queen and the rooks out. So I don't really like playing with this lack of space. What black did here is a freeing attempt with d5, and I like the fact black is looking for activity. So after d5, white took with the pawn, with the e-pawn. As we can see in other lines, white can win a pawn, but that is actually what black needs here to find some counterplay. And this is totally fine for black. Despite being down a pawn, now black's pieces are doing something. This is much better than the other position where pawns were equal. We both had the same amount of pawns, but black had no counterplay. Here we are down a pawn as black, but we've got a lot of play in return. I think this is a much better idea. What else? Instead of knight takes, well, white can take the d pawn. But okay, again, I feel black has a lot of chances to equalize here. It's like our pieces are finding new squares. So white decided to take with the e-pawn. Black takes on d4. Nice in-between move. Knight takes d4. Pawn takes d5. And speaking of piece play over material, white plays bishop f4, which is a nice try. White sacrifices the pawn on c4, but in return is looking for a lot of counterplay and attack. Look at those bishops. It's going to be tough for us to get our queenside pieces out. And clearly we can tell taking the pawn on c4, it's risky to say the least. And I don't think we win a pawn here because we can tell white is able to get that pawn back sooner or later. What really concerns me here is that bishop on g2, the other bishop on f4, and the fact white can try something like knight b5. There's knight c7, there's knight d6. That bishop on g2 is still a nightmare, and engines might say this is equal, but imagine this position from a practical point of view. It's tough to defend this as black, and we're not gonna play like an engine. It's probably it's next to impossible. So after bishop f4, and like what black did in this game, which is more of a human reaction, black gets the bishop out, attacking white's queen, and white plays bishop f3. If white plays something like f3, then this is great for us because we can go back to d7, and then we just killed white's bishop g2. Even if we lost the pawn on d5, we don't lose the pawn, but if we did, that's fine too. I would love to see his pawn on f3. So white, after bishop g4, white plays bishop f3. Black takes, queen takes, and this is that position I wanted to reach. We're still facing some pressure. We're still trying to equalize as black. So here I want you to pause the video, take your time, as I always say, pretend this is a real game and try finding the best practical line for black. So in this position, after queen takes f3, as black, as I was saying, we're still facing some pressure, and let us imagine for a second it is white's go again. What is white trying to do? Is white trying to take the pawn on d5? I don't think so, because then we can just retake. We've got 3 pieces on d5, and actually that would help our bishop as well, especially if we take with knight f6 on d5. He could be trying to take on d5, but that doesn't seem likely at this point. Maybe rook to d1. That seems more accurate. Then white has the same, the rook on the same file as our queen. White's still attacking on d5 and v7. So rook d1 seems to be annoying. What else? After queen takes, white can also try what he was trying after bishop f4, which is playing knight to b5. That's also annoying. There is knight c7, and there is also knight d6. So, as black, we need to act as soon as we can, otherwise there are so many threats, and I don't see how to stop all of them. Rook d1, knight to b5, even c takes d5 might be a threat in some lines. So what can we do? Let's start by analyzing the most natural move, taking on c4. This seems passive. We can tell based on intuition and the things we've been studying in this course. Taking on c4 is not a great idea. White can play knight to b5 and then knight d6, knight c7, the pawn on b7 plus rook d1. Too many threats. I don't see how to handle this in practice. The engine might find a way, but from a practical point of view, this looks bad for black. So I wouldn't take on c4. What else? If we play something like a6, I think this is way too passive as well. It's better than taking on c4. But then white can play rook d1, perhaps rook f d1, so the other rook stays on the queen side. And if we can find tactical resources, then we might get away with this. But again, it is white the one with the one who's putting the pressure on at the moment. So I think unless we don't find anything better, then we can consider a6, which is said that d takes c4 is not part of our options. We're not going to play it. Maybe attacking the bishop on f4. That looks active. I would definitely take a look at knight h5. Problem is, white can simply go back to e3. That is the worst case scenario, and then my knight is misplaced in the corner. And even white, if he's deep enough, can play rook d1 as well. I don't think the trade is helping us at all. We're still facing some pressure here. At least here we got rid of the powerful bishop. But I'm not sure this is enough for equality. So out of the moves we saw so far, I would say that playing this is the best try for black. At least we are attacking some pieces, the bishop on f4, the knight on d4, and we always have to give priority to the moves that are attacking, because initiative is, well, it's not everything in chess, but it means a lot. It's better than playing passive. So what else can black play? There's a move black is actually the move black played in the game, which is rook to c8. And this is exactly the concept we're looking for. We attack the pawn on c4, we get some pieces out, and we might be even considering sacrificing some material if necessary. If white takes, then this is what we want to, because now we free our position, we trade some pieces off. This is excellent for black. If white goes for knight b5, here's where we need to be creative and find ways to deal with this. And again, we might have to sacrifice material. So here I like knight f5. We lose a pawn, yes, but we have a lot of counterplay in return. We control d6, we control c7. If he takes that pawn, then I take on c4. I'm not even losing a pawn. And if he takes on d5, then a6. That knight has no squares to go to. I mean, he might play knight a7, but we know the knight is not getting out of there. So here we see why piece play is so important when we make our decisions. And rook c8 is definitely a good try. It might not work in practice, or it might not work if we analyze this with an engine, but in practice, it is likely to work. And our opponent is white, is now facing the pressure. In the game after rook c8, white played bishop e5. And also white is trying to activate its pieces and not paying attention to material. It's a good thing, actually. And after knight c6, we see some trades. Now the bishop's hanging as well. Rook to e1. To be fair, black got a decent position here. I would say the game is equal, or even black could be slightly better if he plays d4. But just to summarize black's options here after queen takes, if you thought about e5, if he's trying to play for a win, and then I would play knight f5. The engine also recommends rook takes, which is difficult because we're still allowing knight d6. It's not easy to play. The thing is, after knight d6, we do have another tactic which is 100% engine-like. Rook takes, attacking the queen. That knight is hanging, so queen takes, and then we've got g5. And there's no way for white to protect the knight. If queen takes, we take it. Queen e5, well, that queen is under bishop's g7 radar, so knight e4. And again, everything's hanging for white. That queen, by the way, is lost. There's nowhere to move queen e5. And if queen b4, we've got a5. And again, it's impossible to protect that knight. Queen c5 and then b6. I don't think we need to analyze this far. I mean, if you're able to see this, then well done you. That probably means you're a strong player, or you analyze as good as the engine does. But I think these lines, they show what initiative can do for you. We don't have to see all this, but if we think about piece play, then there is a chance we see rook c8. Otherwise, if we start panicking after knight b5, then we won't play rook c8. We'll end up playing something passive like a6. And then white is the one with the initiative. So the other move we can think of here, and that is probably the move I would be inclined to play, is knight to e4. And this is not a pawn sacrifice, but I see the queen and the bishop attacking on d4, so this is a good way to free black's position and to fully equalize. Now, white cannot take on e4 because we win a piece. Now the queen's hanging, and then we take on d4. If white takes here, then we take on c3, followed by queen takes d5, and we've got the best of it. Bad pawns for white on the queen side, great position for black. So probably knight e4, as I was saying, is the easy way for black to free its position. White can still try something like knight b5, but now it's not as easy for white because knight e6 is not even a threat. It might be knight c7, but now we've got more room to maneuver as black. The engine likes g5 here, which is a move I wouldn't play. I think it's just too risky in practice. White's solid, and each pawn we move on the king side could easily fire back later on in the game. We can take on c3. That's also worth considering. But as you can see here, after trading some pieces off, equality is closer. So I think that was, in practice, the best try for black. And technically, the best move is rook c8. And then we saw why this move is so powerful. That line where black takes on c4 and then takes here, that line is just crazy. But again, this shows us what development, initiative, and power play can do for us. And I think that the lesson to be learned here is avoid passive positions unless there's no other option. So with this, I'm going to finish this chapter. I hope you found this useful. I hope you could learn something. And of course, I want to see you guys in the next videos. Thank you.